Hey, everybody. Welcome to chapter 29. We're finally getting to the civil rights movement, one of my favorite chapters of the year. Very excited. I wish we were doing this in person and not on YouTube, but it is what it is. So we talked about this we kind of set up this chapter in some of our prior chapters. But really, African Americans faced three major problems in the 60s that would end up kind of spurring on the civil rights movement. So big one that we've talked about quite a bit already is racial discrimination and also segregation, but there's also income inequality. That's one that was huge at the time, and it's still around today. That one hasn't quite been solved yet. But we're going to talk about kind of how these things, what these things end up causing later. So one of the big types of protests that was used in the 60s was actually something called a sit-in. It's basically going into a place that doesn't allow Black people to be there, like a lunch counter, for example, and sitting there and asking to be served until your demands are met. This happened a lot at restaurants, but it even happened in libraries. Think about it. They're not letting people into libraries. Crazy, right? Movie theaters are another example of this happening at. The first one that had this happen in was in Greensboro, North Carolina. It was at a store called Woolworth. It's kind of like, what would you compare it to? Dillard's or JCPenney, sort of. But they basically had everything. So it was supposed to be like an all-day shopping thing that you go to, and they had everything you would need. It's a big department store. So they even had a lunch counter inside of the store because they didn't want you to leave all day, basically. But that lunch counter at this particular Woolworths was segregated. They didn't serve Black people. And so a group of 4 college students go and they actually sit at this lunch counter and ask to be served. And they don't get served, and they just stay there until eventually the police are called in and drag them out of there. This was the first, it was kind of broadcast around the country that this happened, and other people started emulating that. This actually led to these 4 college students actually started something called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often called SNCC. These are the guys, and that's actually Woolworths right there. So that's their lunch counter. Ironic, right, that there's a Black guy behind the counter, but he can't serve the Black customers. Kind of a double standard for sure. Here's another picture from another sit-in that occurred. You'll notice there's a white guy actually helping them at this. He's also getting stuff dumped on him by the racist crowd there. All right, so another kind of protest that happened was something called a freedom ride. So basically what this would be was groups of people, they were mixed of both white and Black people, challenged some interstate segregation laws. Basically, states cannot control interstate travel. So if a bus route goes from in between several different states, state law cannot dictate if that bus is segregated or not. So this isn't even having to do with individual state laws. This is a national law. And these writers basically were trying to make sure that law was being upheld, which it wasn't. So the first freedom ride actually happened in 1947. It was organized by a group called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. And they basically started from just in the north, and they rode this bus route all the way to the south. They actually ended up stopping in North Carolina because they were afraid that violence would break out if they continued any further south. That was the first one. Basically, what this did was force the Supreme Court to rule that segregation on interstate commerce was illegal, because they kind of pushed the envelope and made that an issue for the whole nation. Here's some people that were on that. They would hold these signs out the window to draw attention to themselves, because that's what they wanted, right? They wanted to bring attention to the problem. But freedom rides continued. They actually tried to go further and further south, and some of these actually became quite violent. Southern states actually ended up ignoring this Supreme Court ruling, and they still forced buses to segregate when they came into their state, which was illegal, but we've seen that doesn't always stop people. CORE decided to go further south. So in 1961, they did another freedom ride. And this was even with the support of the Attorney General at the time, which is Robert Kennedy. Remember, he also gets assassinated. We kind of are going back in time a little bit here. But this is the route that they would take on this freedom ride. So they left DC and went not too much violence until they get to South Carolina. In South Carolina, there's some violence. There's some a group of people attack them at a bus stop. And then you can see there's other events that there's more and more violence as they get further and further south. Here's one picture from this. One interesting thing to think about here is that a lot of people that were doing these kinds of protests weren't Black, right? Many of them were white people who felt like this was wrong and they wanted to help. And a lot of the Southerners that were racist, right? A lot of the people in like the KKK, for example, actually hated the white people that were helping with this more than they hated the Black people. So if you were a white protester, oftentimes you got more assault, more violence acted upon you by these groups of people. So you can see this guy's checking to make sure all his teeth are still there. They're probably not all there. And this is actually a really scary picture here, because this was basically, this could have been a mass murder right here. What happened, the story behind this picture is that a group of people surrounded this bus at a bus stop. They were filling up on gas, and the passengers were still on board. The bus driver decided that there was a gang of people that were getting violent, and he started to try and drive away, and the gang actually slashed their tires and the bus couldn't go anymore. This gang of people actually surrounded the bus and blocked the doors so that the passengers couldn't get out. And one of them actually threw a Molotov cocktail through the window, which basically is just an alcoholic drink of some sort, usually vodka, because it's really high in alcohol, that they've lit a rag in. And once it explodes, it'll actually start it on fire. So these people have blocked the door and then lit the bus on fire. They weren't actually going to let the passengers out. This gang of people were literally going to incinerate everyone inside of this bus. But luckily, one of the people in the gang, the mob, was actually an undercover federal officer. And so he actually pulled a gun on the crowd and told them to back away from the door. And he got everybody off. Could have been a tragedy. Still terrible, but not nearly as bad as it could have been. So another area we'll talk about is in Birmingham. Martin Luther King was here in Birmingham because Birmingham was the most segregated city in America still at this point. And so he, instead of fighting small battles that he knew he could win, what he wanted to do was go and fight a big battle, so that when other cities were being faced with groups protesting their segregation laws, they would realize, okay, well, if Birmingham couldn't do it, then we can't do it, right? So Martin Luther King goes to the strongest place he can and fights against this. The governor of Alabama was actually quoted as saying in one of his speeches on national television, "I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." So that sounds really nice, huh? Yeah, he's a racist. The police chief there was actually a guy named Bull Connor, and he was a very, very staunch supporter of segregation. He was a pretty awful dude too. When you get a chance, watch this video. It's only, 8 minutes, I think. Maybe less, 6, something like that. It's about the Birmingham protests. I should have had a better link for you to copy and paste, but I'll try and figure out how to link it somewhere else. Anyway, check out this video. It's pretty good. Sad, but powerful for sure. So because of the violence that was occurring in Birmingham, President Kennedy decides that he has to step in and do something about this. So he ordered 3,000 federal troops to Alabama and promised to protect citizens, Black or white. Basically, the federal troops kind of force federal laws on on Alabama, and in Birmingham, I should say, and forces desegregation in public places because of basically Kennedy could do what he wanted at that point. The next thing Martin Luther King does is actually organize a march on Washington. The official title of this march was actually the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So it focused a lot on economic stuff too, but the freedom part of it ends up kind of taking the spotlight for sure. They wanted to build upon some of the national attention that they've been getting and kind of draw everybody in with the attention that they've gotten. So in the spring of 1963, there were about 200,000 people that marched on Washington in a peaceful protest. So they actually had like training for people on how to respond to violence peacefully, because they didn't want to be the ones to be on the news beating up people. They would much rather be on the news getting hit than being the ones doing the hitting, right? And so they actually taught people how to not be violent in this. Another video I want you to watch. There's a lot of videos in this that are really powerful, more than I could say to you. So here's another one that I would like you to watch. I think this one's about another 5-6 minutes ish, not too long, but definitely worth your time. All right, so one of the results of all these protests and everything was actually the Civil Rights Act. So Kennedy proposed this act, but unfortunately, he actually didn't have enough power in Congress to get it passed. The Southern Democrats had actually threatened to do a filibuster. Filibuster is a really interesting thing. It's a Senate rule that basically says that any senator can talk for as long as they want about anything. Basically what ends up happening is people just go up there and these windbags just talk and talk and talk and talk until you're like, fine, we won't vote on the stupid thing, right? But the Southerners had threatened to do this, but after JFK was assassinated, Johnson kind of used the everyone's sadness about JFK's assassination to the advantage of the civil rights movement. So he basically said that this was part of Kennedy's legacy and that we had to pass it in order to honor Kennedy. And it ended up passing through Congress because of that. And so this ends up getting passed in 1964. It's called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Basically, it has 10 parts to it, but we're going to talk about a few of those things. Basically, it desegregated most schools in public areas. If you, like a private school, for example, didn't have to desegregate, but other schools did have to. It set up Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which basically would actually go into businesses and make sure that they were being fair with people, hiring a fair amount of minorities, for example, or promoting people based off of merit rather than race. It also allowed the U.S. Attorney General to get involved in any civil rights violation. So instead of a state court trying a case, if the Attorney General wanted to, they could actually pluck that case out and try it themselves. This is super important because if, for example, you have a southern state that is really racist and the courts are all racist, what good is going to court in that southern state, right? The courts are going to always favor the white guy, right, in one of these cases. And so if the Attorney General can actually take that case and try it themselves, then they can actually kind of take over civil rights lawsuits and get rid of the racist element out of it, right? And actually try these cases in a real court that's going to give them justice. A huge deal. It's really important. It also meant that if any group got federal money, they had to treat people equally. So anything that's all schools, that's tons of things, right? Like museums, national parks, all that stuff could no longer segregate or be unfair toward different racial groups. However, one thing that the Civil Rights Act does not do is remove poll taxes. So states could still charge poll taxes if they chose to. All right, another thing that was created during this time is something called affirmative action. This is another big part of the Civil Rights Act. Basically, this requires employers to hire and promote minorities, and that's what the Employment Commission that we talked about on the last slide would go in and enforce, basically. And this isn't just African Americans, it's all minorities. Basically, what they would look at is if your company was hiring a much higher amount of white people than there were in your community, then there would be a problem. So let's say your community is 80% white and 20% black, but your company is hiring 99% white people, then you're probably going to be looked at this way, in a negative way with this affirmative action. And different industries did have different numbers. So some industries, because of, for example, remember at this time, a lot of black people were having a hard time getting into colleges. Their education system wasn't as good because they had been segregated, right? And so some jobs, it wasn't necessarily meant to be completely equal, but they did look at it to see if you were being fair or not with your hiring practices. Okay, so school busing is another big concern during this. By 1964, a lot of places still weren't following Brown versus Board. 2% of African American kids were actually in integrated schools at this point. And so finally in 1973, the Supreme Court ordered that all schools had to integrate, like no more dragging your feet. Let's do this thing. Um, so busing became a big part of how they made this happen. Um, and a lot of people were actually really upset about this because you would have, for example, kind of with our last thing too, affirmative action sometimes meant that Black people were promoted over white people because the company didn't want to look bad, right? So a white guy might have tons of qualifications, he may have the experience, he may have the education, but the company is afraid to promote him because maybe they haven't promoted enough Black people, right? And so they might give someone who's less qualified the position, right? And the same thing kind of happens with school busing. Black people have been mistreated with having to go to these schools far away from home, right? We talked about this with Brown versus Board, but now the reverse, it ends up happening in reverse to white people too. Some white people end up having to be bused further away to further schools that are worse because of integration. And so some people who were not racist, who didn't have anything against the civil rights movement, actually are kind of turned off from the civil rights movement because of these two issues that caused some problems for them individually. So a lot of people started to resent integration because of these things. And like I said, not all of them were racist. Some of them were just people who ended up getting kind of, they kind of got the short end of the stick in this case, and they weren't very happy about it. But I think overall, it fixed a lot more problems than it created, for sure. Voting rights were another big concern during this time. SNCC was trying to get as many people to register in Mississippi as possible. There were 900,000 African Americans that were eligible to vote in Mississippi, but in 1964, a very, very small percentage of those people were actually registered. So a lot of people, 1,000 volunteers go down to help register people to vote. And while there, 3 of them actually were murdered. The 3 of these 1,000 volunteers were found dead, and 7 white men were charged with their murder. Now remember, before the Civil Rights Act, what do you think would have happened with this case? Right? 7 white guys are charged with the murder of 3 volunteers that were trying to register Black people to vote in Mississippi. Right? The case would have been thrown out. Suddenly they would have lost all of the evidence, or something like that probably would have happened, and these guys would have gotten away. But after the Civil Rights Act, this case becomes a federal case. It's tried in a federal court, and the federal court finds them guilty, right? And so that's a big deal. And this starts to kind of curb the violence that's happening in a lot of cases. Now people realize that they're not going to get away with these attacks on Black people. They're not going to get away with murdering Black people anymore. So it starts to slow down the amount of violence that's happening from the KKK and other groups like that. Another thing that ended up happening during this time in protest was Selma. In Alabama, only 1% of the voters were African American, even though over half of the population was African American. So very, very few of the Black voters there were actually registered to vote. And when they were attempted to register to vote, there was oftentimes the poll taxes or literacy tests or other things that kept them from being able to vote. And sometimes even just straight up violence kept them from voting. So Dr. King went down there and tried to support a drive for voting rights. And while he was there, there was actually another murder. A young African-American man was killed. The local police didn't do very much to try and find any evidence for this. And so they organized a march. They marched from Selma all the way to Montgomery, which is the capital. It's a 50-mile march. And they were doing this march to protest this murder and what the police had done to try and solve the murder. During this, the marchers were actually attacked by mobs of racists, but also even the police and police dogs. There was a bridge where they were really attacked by state troopers, actually. If you have a chance, it's rated PG-13, so check with your parents, but there's a fantastic movie about this just called Selma. Came out, 10 years ago. No, 8 years ago. So it's not too old, but really good film. PG-13 for violence and some language, but have your parents look into it if you'd like. So President Johnson is having to deal with a lot of this stuff after Kennedy's assassination. And so he pushes for something called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He basically wanted to make it so that states could no longer bar people from voting based off of their race. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which outlawed literacy tests. At the same time, the 24th Amendment was passed, which made poll taxes illegal. So two big things happened that year that really made it so that voting was a lot more fair. And some of these other protests weren't necessary anymore. But during this time, not all of our protests were nonviolent. We've talked about a lot of nonviolent protests, but some of them actually did end up becoming violent, especially in big cities in the North. A lot of these minorities, especially Black people, didn't have access to education. They didn't have access to healthcare. Their jobs were either really low paying or they didn't even have jobs. And so there were actually a lot of riots that occurred from 1964 to 69. There were actually about 150 race riots spread out over these 5 years. One of the worst ones was actually in Watts, California. It ended up leaving 34 people dead, 4,000 arrests, $200 million in damages. And what's really sad about this is actually Watts, the damage ended up happening in mostly Black communities. So Black people were angry, and in their protests and anger, they actually ended up damaging their own community more than anything else. Here's some of the footage or the images from that. Pretty bad stuff. All right, so Martin Luther King we've talked about quite a bit, but he's been doing a lot of good. In one case, he was actually in April of 1968, he was actually in Tennessee to help sanitation workers who were fighting for equal pay. These were mostly Black workers that had been denied raises while white people were given raises and other issues. And so he was there to try and help them get equal treatment. And as he was speaking to them, he was at his hotel after speaking to them, and he was talking to one of his associates. It was a motel that was a 2-level motel. He's leaning out over the railing, talking to somebody down on the ground. And as he's there, he is shot and killed. They ended up finding a .30-06 rifle with James Earl Ray's fingerprints on it. He was found guilty of the murder. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories around this because he was an escaped convict on the run who gets a gun, finds out where Martin Luther King is, and shoots him, right? So you can see why a lot of people thought this was a conspiracy. I don't know if it was. Maybe he's just a crazy racist dude. I don't know. It's hard to say. A lot of people end up blaming this on the FBI. Another group, so we talked a lot about Martin Luther King and kind of his nonviolent protest ideas. There was another group of people that started something called the Black Power movement. This actually started during the Selma March. There were kind of two competing ideals going on. Martin Luther King's group of people during the Selma March were calling out freedom now. That was kind of their slogan. That was their chant that they would say. Actually, it was freedom now as they marched. But other leaders had their groups chanting Black Power. Now, Martin Luther King and the leaders of these groups actually had some fierce debates about this. The people supporting Black Power were basically saying Black people have power that we need to harness. And they're talking about economic power, right? Like we can boycott you and cause you to have economic struggles if you don't support the rights of Black people, kind of like what happened with the Montgomery bus boycott. They're talking about voting power, right? Black people have political power. And so that's kind of what they're trying to focus on. But Martin tells them, like, you guys, words have a lot of power. When you say Black power, many people might see it the way you're trying to push it. They might see that you're talking about political or economic power, but a lot of other people are going to see violence in those words. And so he tried to talk them out of using this slogan, but they disagreed on that, and they didn't really come to a consensus on that. Dr. King still used his slogan of freedom now, and the Black Power movement begins. One of the big proponents of Black Power was a guy named Malcolm X. He paved the way for the Black Power movement before it really took root. He didn't use that phrase at first, but he did later. He was a very, very powerful speaker. he convinced a lot of people to follow what was called the Nation of Islam, or sometimes called the Black Nationalists or the Black Muslims. Um, he he's got a really interesting story. He was born Malcolm Little, and as a kid, his dad was actually murdered. He was found dead at the railroad tracks, basically murdered by the KKK, probably, but nobody investigated because they didn't care, which is really sad. And that's how Malcolm grew up, right? His father was murdered when he was a young boy. He had a lot of anger and resentment, as you can imagine. And he ends up becoming a common criminal. He goes to jail for theft. And while in prison, he actually meets some people who start to teach him about the principles and the ideals behind Islam, behind being a Muslim. And in prison, he actually converts to Islam. And he ends up changing his name. So in prison, he also learns that most of the Black names that are out there, Black people's last names, oftentimes were just taken from their master. So when your family was freed from their master, you didn't have a Black last name if you were a freed slave. And so a lot of times they just took the name of their former master as kind of their name. And so Malcolm was horrified actually when he heard this, because he'd always thought of his name as something important to him, right? He was part of the Little family, and he was going to represent his family well. Well, he realized that anything he did positive was actually looking good on his former slave master. And that was not something he was okay with. So he actually changed his name, and he wanted to have his original name, but his name had been stolen from him, right? His ancestors had that name stolen from them when they came from Africa. So he didn't know what to put there. And so he came up with something else. He came up with a placeholder until he could figure out what his name was. So from then on out, he was known as Malcolm X. X just being like in math, right? Something we don't know. It's a variable. Kind of an interesting way he got his name. This is Malcolm. He was a really, really powerful speaker. He was funny. He's charismatic. People really liked him. He was a lot more fun to listen to than most of the other speakers. But he was kind of directly opposed to some of the ideas of Martin Luther King. Malcolm was actually assassinated before Martin. Or excuse me, I said that backwards. My bad. Anyway, so Malcolm X was actually ended up being assassinated as well. He was giving a speech in New York City, and there had been some kind of drama around Malcolm at this time. He actually left the Black Muslims, the Muslim Brotherhood, and started kind of his own group, because he had seen, like, he went to Mecca, which Muslims are supposed to do at one point in their life. They're supposed to go at least once to visit Mecca. It's their pilgrimage. And in Mecca, he saw an integrated society. He saw white people. He saw Black people. He saw Middle Eastern people. He saw all of them living in harmony in Mecca. And so he knew that race wasn't the problem. There's something else causing this problem. I mean, race is a problem, but it wasn't insurmountable. White people could get along with Black people if they had a reason to. And so he decided to leave the Black Muslims and start his own group. He was giving a speech in New York City, and there was a disturbance in the crowd. So Malcolm's bodyguards go to take care of this disturbance. And when that happens, a group of gunmen actually charge the stage. 3 of them do, and they actually shoot Malcolm a total of 21 times. He dies on the stage in this theater. One of them was captured right away. 2 others were captured later. These guys were actually members of the Nation of Islam, or the Muslim Brotherhood, who had assassinated him because they were angry he had left and drawn away some of his followers. You can see back there, that's the backdrop of the stage. Those are just some of the bullet holes that missed Malcolm. 21 hit him, but some didn't. There's also a lot of conspiracies with this one. Many people basically claim that the FBI again was involved with Malcolm's death. So there's lots of reasons for this, why people think it's a conspiracy. There's also a lot of reasons why it makes sense that it wasn't a conspiracy. We don't have time to go into it all. There's documentaries, but most of them are just people's opinions. So we end up having a lot of effects of all this, right? There's basically the civil rights movement was a combination of nonviolent protests and radical ideas for the most part. There were some violence issues, there were some riots and things like that, but most of the civil rights movement was kind of built around nonviolent protests and radical ideas. These ideas are things that they want to change, right? And this resulted in a lot of forms of discrimination becoming illegal, with the passing of several laws, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, among them the 24th Amendment as well. These protests create change, which is awesome. Okay, that is all for today. I know that was rather long. I'm sorry, but there's a lot to get through there. Watch those videos when you can, and enjoy your spring break, you guys.